The Joe Budden podcast might be falling apart right in front of the audience, and this latest episode felt way deeper than jokes. Joe Budden sounded irritated. Flip sounded defensive. And Marc Lamont Hill's name kept coming up in a conversation that felt uncomfortable, personal, and almost too real for the cameras. At one point, Flip hinted that Joe called him privately about something they couldn't talk about on air, and the second Joe started trying to shut the conversation down, fans instantly knew there was real tension behind the scenes. Then came the moment that changed the entire energy. Flip mentioning Marc talking to himself on the balcony and admitting he didn't want to joke if Marc was actually going through something serious. That wasn't content anymore. That sounded personal. Now fans are connecting dots everywhere. Is Flip pushing things too far? Is Joe secretly trying to control the cast before Drake's season explodes? And is Marc Lamont Hill quietly reaching his breaking point while the cameras keep rolling? Because for the first time in a long time, the JP didn't feel like a podcast. It felt like a room full of people trying very hard not to expose what's really happening behind the scenes. It felt like a room full of people trying very hard not to expose what's really happening behind the scenes. And that's exactly why fans haven't stopped talking about this episode. Because if you really pay attention to the energy, the body language, the awkward pauses, and the way Joe Budden kept trying to redirect the conversation, you can tell something deeper is brewing inside the Joe Budden podcast universe right now. This wasn't regular potting. This wasn't the usual loud jokes, fake screaming, and viral moments they know how to manufacture for clips. Nah, this felt tense. Real tense. The weirdness started almost immediately. Before the jokes could even settle in, Flip brought up a private conversation with Joe from earlier that morning. And the second he said, "You called me and asked me if I was," before stopping himself, Joe instantly looked uncomfortable. That's when the entire vibe shifted. You could hear it in Joe's tone too. He wasn't laughing like normal. He wasn't doing the sarcastic podfather routine. He sounded like somebody trying to keep a situation contained before it spiraled out of control on camera. And when Joe said, "We can't talk about this," that honestly told fans more than if he had just addressed it directly. Because when has this podcast ever had boundaries? This is the same platform that built its identity on oversharing, public arguments, exposing personal business, and turning tension into entertainment. So when Joe suddenly wants privacy, fans immediately assume something serious happened behind the scenes. And honestly, I think Flip crossed a line. Now don't get it twisted, Flip has always been chaos. That's literally why he works on the show. He brings unpredictable energy. He interrupts people. He turns small moments into dramatic moments. He pokes at sensitive topics because he knows eventually somebody will react emotionally and create a viral clip. That's his entire formula. But there's a difference between creating entertaining chaos and accidentally exposing somebody who might actually be struggling behind the scenes. That's where Marc Lamont Hill enters the conversation. Because over the last few months, fans have quietly noticed that Marc's energy has changed. Sometimes he looks disconnected. Sometimes he seems exhausted. Other times he looks like he's trying to intellectually rise above the nonsense happening around him while everybody else is farming jokes and reactions. And whether people agree with Marc or not, one thing is obvious. He takes himself seriously. He protects his image. He protects his intellect. He protects how he's perceived publicly. So when Flip casually mentions Marc talking to himself on the balcony, fans immediately interpreted it differently. That didn't sound like harmless roasting. That sounded personal. And suddenly people started revisiting everything. The awkward moments. The tension-filled exchanges. The passive-aggressive jokes. The weird chemistry between Marc and Flip lately. Because if we're being honest, there's been a cold war brewing between them for a while now. Marc is sharp, calculated, and articulate. Flip is emotional, impulsive, and thrives in disorder. They're complete opposites. And sometimes opposites create entertaining podcast chemistry. But other times, it creates hidden resentment. You can actually see it in the way Marc reacts to Flip now. Early on, Marc used to engage more with the jokes. He'd debate. He'd push back. But lately it feels like he's tolerating Flip more than actually enjoying him. Almost like he's trying not to snap publicly. And Flip feels that energy too. That's why he keeps escalating. Because deep down, Flip wants reactions. He feeds off reactions. The moment the room gets awkward, he gets stronger. But this time, Joe looked genuinely irritated. Not performatively irritated for content. Actually irritated. And fans picked up on that immediately. Especially when Joe started talking about how he doesn't backbite behind the scenes. That line was important. Because that sounded less like podcast banter and more like somebody defending themselves after a private disagreement already happened off camera. Almost like Joe had already warned Flip about certain behavior, and Flip brought it to the air anyway. That's where things get dangerous for the podcast. Because once fans believe there's real tension behind the scenes, every little interaction becomes evidence. Now suddenly people are analyzing facial expressions, silences, interruptions. Who talks over who? Who laughs at whose jokes? Who Joe protects? Who Joe shuts down? And right now, a lot of people think Joe is trying to stabilize the show before things explode again publicly. Remember, the Joe Budden podcast has already survived multiple public breakups, cast reshuffles, internet wars, leaked tensions, and friendship collapses. Joe knows what public implosions look like better than almost anybody in media. So the second he senses chaos forming again, he tries to manage it early. That's why this situation feels different. Joe isn't adding fuel to the fire. He's trying to contain it. And ironically, that containment is making fans even more suspicious. Then there's the timing of all this. Because Drake season changes everything. Anytime Drake drops music, the entire hip-hop media ecosystem shifts into survival mode. Everybody suddenly has stronger opinions. Everybody starts choosing sides. And on the JBP specifically, Drake discussions always create tension because everybody on that couch approaches him differently. Joe gets emotional and analytical. Ice gets defensive. Ish tries to sound logical. Flip gets loud and reactionary. Marc tends to intellectualize things from a wider cultural angle. That mixture can either create legendary content or absolute disaster. And fans know it. Which is why people are now wondering if Joe is quietly evaluating who he can trust during these major episodes moving forward. Because whether people admit it or not, the biggest moments on the podcast often determine who gains influence behind the scenes, who gets more mic time, who appears on Patreon, who gets pushed in marketing clips, who Joe starts valuing more publicly. That's why B. suddenly reappearing on Rewind caught everybody's attention too. Because fans don't think anything on the JP happens accidentally anymore. Every appearance feels strategic. Every absence feels intentional. Every lineup change starts looking political. And honestly, that paranoia exists because the show trained its audience to think this way. The JP audience doesn't just consume content anymore. They investigate it. That's why this Marc and Flip situation exploded so quickly online. Reddit threads started connecting theories immediately. Twitter Spaces started debating whether Flip went too far. Fans started revisiting older episodes looking for hidden tension. And once audiences start doing forensic analysis on podcast interactions, that means the entertainment has become bigger than the actual topics being discussed. Now the story is the cast. Not the music. Not the culture debates. Not even the celebrity gossip. The real fascination now is watching the chemistry slowly evolve in real time. And if we're being completely honest, that's probably exactly what keeps this podcast alive. And if we're being completely honest, that's probably exactly what keeps this podcast alive. Because the Joe Budden podcast stopped being just a podcast a long time ago. It became a reality show disguised as commentary. People still come for the music takes, the industry gossip, the debates about Drake, Kendrick, or whoever's trending that week. But the reason audiences stay invested is because of the personalities, the egos, the tension, and the feeling that at any moment, somebody might finally snap on camera. That unpredictability is the real product. And Queen's Flip understands that better than anybody in the room. The problem is, Joe understands it too. Which means eventually there was always going to be a collision between Flip's need to create chaos and Joe's need to control it. That's why this recent interaction felt so revealing. For the first time in a while, It genuinely looked like Joe was worried about what Flip might say next. Not annoyed. Not fake irritated for content. Actually cautious. And when Joe Budden starts becoming careful with words on his platform, that's when you know the temperature behind the scenes is hotter than people realize. Because Joe usually loves mess. He monetizes mess. He built an empire off mess. But this time, he kept trying to shut doors before they fully opened. And fans noticed. Especially during the moments where Flip kept dancing around whatever private conversation they had earlier that morning. You could almost hear Flip testing boundaries in real time. Like he wanted to say more, but he also wanted Joe to stop him first. That's a very specific dynamic that happens when people already argued privately before cameras started rolling. It becomes less about the actual topic and more about power. Who controls the narrative? Who gets the last word? Who gets protected publicly? Who gets embarrassed publicly? And right now, a lot of viewers think Joe is trying to quietly reposition the hierarchy of the show. That's why some fans believe Flip has been on thin ice for a while now. Not because he lacks entertainment value, actually the opposite. Flip might honestly be one of the most naturally viral personalities Joe has ever added to the cast. The guy knows how to create moments out of nothing. He understands internet culture, emotional reactions, awkward tension, and theatrical energy better than most creators. But that same talent can also become dangerous. Because there's a fine line between controlled chaos and uncontrollable chaos. And lately, it feels like Flip keeps stepping closer to that line. Especially when it comes to Marc Lamont Hill. Now let's talk about something people don't really say out loud. Marc was never supposed to fit into this environment naturally. Think about it. You have a politically connected academic intellectual sitting next to loud personalities whose entire job is to weaponize jokes, interruptions, sarcasm, and viral controversy. Marc comes from debate stages, news platforms, lectures, and intellectual spaces. The JP comes from barbershop energy mixed with internet toxicity and entertainment theatrics. That contrast was always going to create friction eventually. At first, that contrast actually helped the show. Marc brought balance. He made conversations feel more intelligent. He could challenge Joe without sounding emotional. He gave the podcast credibility in conversations that otherwise would have turned into pure screaming matches. But over time, something changed. The audience started realizing Marc wasn't fully participating in the circus energy of the pod anymore. Sometimes he looked exhausted by it. Sometimes annoyed. Sometimes emotionally detached. And the more serious Marc became, the more Flip seemed to poke at him. That's where fans started sensing hidden tension. Because Flip doesn't just joke randomly. He targets reactions. And Marc gives subtle reactions. Tiny reactions. Facial expressions. Quiet frustration. The kind of responses that internet audiences love to psychoanalyze frame by frame. So every little exchange between them started becoming content within the content. Then came the balcony comment. And honestly, that moment changed the entire atmosphere. Because there's certain jokes people let slide, until they suddenly don't. Saying somebody was talking to themselves on the balcony may sound harmless at first glance, but when fans already suspect someone is mentally or emotionally overwhelmed, the joke lands differently. Suddenly it stops sounding funny and starts sounding invasive. That's why Joe reacted the way he did. I truly think Joe realized in real time that the audience was going to take those comments seriously. And once that happens, you lose control of the narrative immediately. Now everybody's speculating, is Marc stressed behind the scenes? Is he frustrated with the cast? Is he regretting joining the show? Are there real arguments happening off camera? And the more silence there is, the louder those theories become. That's the curse of podcast culture today. Audiences no longer separate entertainment from reality. They assume every awkward interaction reflects a deeper truth. Every joke becomes coded messaging. Every absence becomes a hidden beef. Every uncomfortable silence becomes evidence of a secret war happening backstage. And to be fair, sometimes they're right. The JBP especially has trained fans to think that way because historically, the biggest podcast explosions usually started as small awkward moments first. People remember the Rory and Mal era. People remember the subtle tension before the fallout. The passive-aggressive comments, the weird energy, the interruptions, the defensive body language. Back then, fans noticed the cracks before the cast admitted they existed. So now audiences watch everything differently. That's why this current situation feels bigger than one uncomfortable joke about Marc. People think they're watching the beginning of another shift. And honestly, they might be. Because Joe Budden is clearly evolving the podcast again. The introduction of Rewind, the increased Patreon strategy, the rotating appearances, the careful editing, the selective transparency. It all feels intentional. Just how certain people get cropped out of clips now, or how some narratives quietly disappear without explanation. The JBP used to thrive on reckless openness. Now it feels more curated, more controlled, more corporate in a weird way. And ironically, that polished approach creates even more suspicion among viewers, because audiences can feel when something's being hidden. That's why Rewind is such an interesting piece of this entire puzzle too. Some fans genuinely enjoy it because it gives extra insight into the cast dynamics. Others think it's basically damage control disguised as behind-the-scenes content. Like the show wants viewers to feel close enough to the real drama without ever actually exposing the real drama. Performative transparency. That's the perfect phrase for it. The audience feels like they're getting access while still being strategically manipulated. And honestly, Joe Budden might be one of the best in media at doing exactly that. He understands modern audiences better than people give him credit for. He knows mystery creates engagement. He knows speculation creates clips. He knows unresolved tension keeps fans emotionally invested longer than actual answers do. That's why moments like this become gold for the internet. Not because viewers necessarily care about the original argument, but because they care about what the argument represents. Instability, power struggles, ego clashes, friendships changing, people secretly reaching their limits. That's the real entertainment now. And the scary part is, the cast themselves might not even fully realize how transparent they've become to the audience. Because when people spend years watching the same personalities every week, fans start recognizing emotional shifts immediately. They notice when laughs become forced. They notice when chemistry feels strained. They notice when somebody suddenly stops engaging naturally. And right now, a lot of viewers think Marc Lamont Hill is emotionally distancing himself from the chaos around him. The question is, how long can that last before somebody finally says something they can't take back? The question is, how long can that last before somebody finally says something they can't take back? Because that's always how these situations end. Not with one giant explosive moment, but with weeks of tension, awkward jokes, passive-aggressive comments, hidden irritation, and emotional fatigue slowly piling on top of each other until eventually somebody stops caring about protecting the chemistry. And honestly, the scariest part about this current JP situation is that everybody involved looks emotionally tired in completely different ways. Joe looks tired of managing personalities. Marc looks tired of tolerating chaos. Flip looks tired of feeling controlled. And the audience looks tired of pretending they don't see the tension. That's why this moment feels bigger than just another episode. It feels like the beginning of a transition period. And transitions are dangerous for shows like this, because the Joe Budden podcast has always operated on emotional energy. The chemistry matters more than structure. People tune in because they want authenticity, or at least the illusion of authenticity. The second the audience starts believing the cast members secretly dislike each other off camera, every interaction becomes uncomfortable to watch. That's why Joe is in such a difficult position right now. Because on one hand, conflict drives engagement. He knows that better than anybody. Viral tension built this platform. Some of the biggest moments in JBP history came from arguments, uncomfortable debates, and emotional confrontations. But on the other hand, too much real tension destroys trust inside the room. And Joe has already lived through what happens when workplace frustration becomes public warfare. That Rory and Mal breakup changed the way Joe operates forever, whether he admits it or not. Before that fallout, the podcast felt reckless and loose. Afterward, everything became more calculated. Joe became more protective of the brand, more strategic about appearances, and way more aware of how quickly audiences can turn behind-the-scenes drama into career-defining narratives. That's why this Marc and Flip situation probably worries him more than people realize. Because it's not really about one joke. It's about patterns. Flip constantly pushing boundaries. Marc slowly withdrawing emotionally. Fans aggressively speculating online. And Joe being forced to play referee instead of entertainer. That combination never ends peacefully. And here's the crazy part. I actually think Joe likes both of them for completely different reasons. Marc gives the show intelligence, credibility, and structure. Flip gives the show unpredictability, virality, and emotional chaos. Take either one away, and the podcast changes dramatically. Without Marc, discussions lose depth. Without Flip, the energy loses danger. So Joe's trying to maintain balance, while also preventing either side from completely exploding publicly. That's probably why he sounded so frustrated during that conversation. He knows how valuable tension can be for content, but he also knows when tension starts becoming personal. And once things become personal, that's when jokes stop being jokes. That's why fans reacted so strongly to the balcony comments. Not because the comment itself was devastating, but because it felt like the audience accidentally overheard something private. Something that wasn't supposed to become entertainment. And once viewers feel like they've seen a real crack behind the curtain, they become obsessed with finding more. That's exactly what's happening now. Every clip is being dissected. Every interaction is being overanalyzed. Every episode now carries this weird feeling where fans are waiting for somebody to finally lose patience. And with Drake's season approaching, the pressure only gets worse. Because major music moments expose cast chemistry fast. Those episodes are high-pressure environments. Everybody wants strong takes. Everybody wants viral moments. Everybody wants to dominate the conversation. And if there's already hidden tension behind the scenes, those emotionally charged debates can easily push people over the edge. Especially someone like Flip. Because Flip operates emotionally. When he feels cornered, ignored, or checked publicly, he tends to escalate. That unpredictability is what makes him entertaining, but it's also what makes him dangerous in sensitive environments. And Joe knows that. That's why some fans believe Joe has quietly started tightening control over the show. More structured conversations. More selective appearances. More strategic editing. More curated content through Rewind and Patreon. It's almost like Joe is trying to evolve the podcast into a more polished media machine, while still pretending it's the same chaotic family atmosphere fans originally fell in love with. But audiences can feel the difference now. The rawness doesn't feel as accidental anymore. The transparency feels managed. The drama feels partially controlled until it suddenly slips out by mistake. And ironically, those accidental moments are now the most interesting parts of the show. That's why this situation blew up online so quickly. People weren't reacting to a simple argument. They were reacting to the possibility of something deeper happening underneath the surface. And in modern podcast culture, possibility is more powerful than proof. Theories spread faster than facts. Speculation creates more engagement than explanations. Mystery keeps audiences emotionally attached. That's why fans are now asking questions the podcast probably doesn't want to answer. Is Marc happy on the show? Does Flip secretly resent how much Joe checks him? Is Joe preparing another cast evolution? Is B. being positioned more strategically moving forward? And how many tensions are being hidden from the audience right now? Because make no mistake, there are absolutely conversations happening behind closed doors that viewers will never hear. And honestly, that's probably for the best. Not every frustration needs to become content. Not every emotional moment should be monetized. Not every private struggle should become a viral clip for internet entertainment. But the problem with the JP ecosystem is that the line between real life and content became blurry years ago. Everybody performs. Everybody reacts. Everybody protects their image while also trying to appear authentic. And eventually, that balancing act starts exhausting people emotionally. You can see it happening in real time now. That's why Marc's energy stands out so much lately. He feels like somebody trying to survive the chaos without fully becoming part of it. Meanwhile, Flip feels like somebody addicted to creating moments even when those moments become uncomfortable. And Joe? Joe feels like somebody trying to hold together a machine that constantly threatens to self-destruct because chaos is both its greatest strength and its biggest weakness. That's the irony of the Joe Budden podcast. The dysfunction is what made it legendary, but that same dysfunction may eventually become impossible to control. And maybe that's why this recent episode felt so unsettling. Not because fans finally discovered tension exists behind the scenes, but because for the first time in a long time, the cast looked like they were struggling to hide it.